federal government has announced a plan to ban the export of live sheep from Australia. Comes after an independent panel urged the government to introduce a ban. Now, this isn't something that's going to come into effect overnight. We still have quite a process ahead of us. So the draft laws are expected to be introduced by next year, and then the legislation will come into effect from May 2028. So we're looking at quite a process here. And this all comes about after an independent panel urged the federal government to actually introduce a ban on this.
Okay, so for people who aren't familiar with this topic, let's go back. What do you mean when you say live sheep exports?
So I think a good starting place is to highlight the fact that Australia sends a lot of things overseas. We send coal, iron, wine, meat, and sometimes animals for meat.
Right.
So when we're talking about the live export of sheep, we are referring to the commercial transport of livestock overseas. Now, if you're wondering why Australia would be sending sheep that are, living overseas, it's because livestock exports are used by countries whose domestic agricultural industries can't meet demand for meat. So they look elsewhere and they're finding a way to bolster their own means. And there are a number of reasons why this might be necessary. Sometimes it's a matter of not having the right cooling facilities to actually store packed meat domestically, and so they need to import this livestock. Other times it's about culturally specific slaughtering practices. So in some religions, for example, animals need to be slaughtered in a certain way.
Right. And it's a big industry, right?
It certainly has been in the past. To give you a sense of the financials, live sheep exports accounted for $77 million in the 2022-23 financial year.
Okay.
But that was quite dramatically down from where it had been. So at its peak, it was $338 million.
Wow.
That was in 1983.
Okay.
So quite a steady decline there. At that point, 7.3 million sheep were exported from Australia. And that was thanks to this increased demand for meat that we were seeing in the Middle East. But as other countries have built up their own kind of capabilities internally to do this themselves, they don't need to be importing the same levels that they once were. And so as a result, we've seen the demand for Australian live sheep exports really drop quite dramatically.
And what are the key criticisms of this industry?
Yeah, so these practices have faced a lot of scrutiny over the years. This is by no means a new idea, and there have been a lot of animal welfare concerns over the export of live sheep. So in 2011, the Gillard Labor government, who was in government at the time, banned live cattle exports to Indonesia after footage of mistreatment became public. The ban was later overturned, but tighter restrictions were imposed on shipping conditions and abattoir conditions in those receiving countries. Then in 2017, 2,400 sheep died from heat stress and other causes on their way from WA to the Middle East. At the time, the then Agriculture Minister David Littleproud, who you'll be familiar with, he's now the leader of the Nationals, at the time he said he was shocked and gutted by that incident. Further reforms to limit the risk of heat stress on sheep exports were implemented then in 2019. These included not allowing as many sheep onto ships in summertime, obviously when it's hotter, launching an investigation if more than 1 in every 100 sheep dies, and also implementing tougher penalties for companies that broke any of those rules. So that was introduced in 2019.
And then there was an incident this year, right?
Yeah, so earlier this year, an export ship with thousands of livestock on board spent several weeks stranded off the coast of WA in heatwave conditions.
Right.
So this issue has been a really big one for many years. I mean, we spoke earlier of the Gillard government. So it's been over a decade of governments having to come to terms to deal with this issue that there are animal rights concerns about the way that these sheep are being treated when they are being exported. And there have been many calls for the practice to end.
And now we've seen this weekend some major movement from the government. What did the government do?
So the government's response begins back in March last year when they appointed an independent panel to examine what a proposed ban on live sheep exports would look like. So the panel's final report was then handed down in October of last year, and it recommended a transition away from live sheep exports towards a total ban by 2028. So that's where this idea of a phased approach came from. And then over the weekend, the federal government announced that it would accept that recommended ban.
Right. So that was the big announcement there.
Yeah, it was a really big deal. I think on the one hand, there have been lots of calls for it over a long period of time. And on the other, this is a lot of people's livelihoods.
Yeah.
And there are some concerns about the way that this could be phased out and what it will mean for jobs. The government's promised $107 million for the transition as we phase out of live sheep exports. Most of this will go towards helping farmers to expand domestic practices to prepare for the ban and what that will do financially for them.
Hello, I'm James and I produce the video you're watching. If you're enjoying what you're watching, we'd love it if you considered subscribing and checking us out on our other platforms. It'd really help in getting the word out about what we're doing here at TDA. Thanks very much, and now back to the deep dive.
And I assume that's why there's that couple of years runway to get everybody.
Yeah, you can't do it overnight. And certainly none of the recommendations suggested they do that.
And so what's the response been to such a major policy?
I'd say very different depending on where you sit on this issue.
Okay,
quite a divisive issue.
Talk me through that.
So WA is the main state where live sheep exports take place. And it's the state where this proposal has been the most unpopular, at least at a political level. I mean, not surprisingly, but it is interesting to note that it is a Labor government in power there. And
True.
we have a Labor government in power federally. I mean, we have a Labor government almost everywhere except Tasmania. And the Premier of WA, Roger Cook, has come out pretty strongly against the ban, saying it's going to negatively impact the state's regional communities. He flagged possible job losses and he argued that the federal government's transition funding isn't going to go far enough to support farmers and the economy. So again, a Labor Premier in WA pushing back against the federal government's announcement here. In sticking with WA, the opposition leader, Shane Love, also opposed the ban and accused the federal government of shutting WA farmers out of the decision. So pretty uniform opposition there
Both
in
major
Western
parties,
Australia.
yeah.
If we go back to a federal level, Nationals leader and Shadow Agriculture Minister David Littleproud, who I mentioned before, he said that the coalition would reverse the ban if it wins next year's election, and he echoed Premier Cook's concerns about job losses. One of the other points that David Littleproud's been making is that the trade will continue with worse welfare practices elsewhere.
Right.
So this is the whole idea of, a black market and unregulated and what happens if you just can't see what's happening and that there will be worse standards for animals if we can't regulate it at all because it's banned. That sort of sentiment is echoed by the National Farmers Federation. They've said it will negatively impact trade partnerships in the Middle East and it will lead to poorer animal welfare outcomes for sheep exported from other countries.
Okay, so either on a state or a federal level, there's not a huge amount of political support here. I mean, obviously the government's in support of their own policy, but besides from them, there's not a heap.
Well, I will just say that the government in spruiking this ban has been citing a figure that was by McCrindle Research from last year that said that 71% of West Australians want live sheep exports by sea to end.
Right.
So, I mean, that's the kind of
and that's where we
social capital they're looking at.
And we can separate then the political response from what the government says is the population response. But I do think we also need to talk about the response of animal rights activists.
Yes.
What are they saying in response to the government's policy?
Yeah, so as expected, they are fully supportive of the government's policy. RSPCA Australia strongly welcomed the ban, which CEO Richard Muscle described as a clear plan to phase out a cruel and unfixable industry. The group said that the government knows, and the majority of Australians know, that live sheep export is unsustainable, unjustifiable, and completely unnecessary in modern Australia. The RSPCA also commended the government on the $107 million. That was the funding I said was going to go to help
that
the
transition
farmers
funding.
Yeah, so they said that funding like this was critical to the success of the phase out and they were supportive of that measure. As with many other proposals that we speak about on the podcast, I do just want to highlight, though, before we end, that the government still needs to introduce legislation, then it needs to pass, and only then does it become the law. So still a bit to go before that's the case, and nothing is set in stone at this point. So definitely one to keep an eye on.
It's catching me off guard at the moment a little bit when you're referring to a federal election being a year away. I mean, we're almost now into kind of election season here in Australia when we're watching it overseas in the US, and we're going to see more announcements geared towards that election. Thank you, Zara, for explaining that to us. And thank you for listening to this episode of the Daily Aus. I'd love to know what you think about the topics that we've talked about today, and if there's any topics you think we should talk about in the future. We're going to come back to you again tomorrow. Until then, have a great day.